the cloud? Or even better, how do you use the cloud to make your business grow faster and be able to create an even better business? Well, that's exactly what we're diving into today. And with us today is Leon Kuperman. Now, he's a co-founder and CTO at Castai and ensures developers focus on building great products instead of worrying about their cloud infrastructure. Now, combining instant AI-driven cloud optimization with Kubernetes, this is one platform that cuts cloud bills in half, boosts the power of DevOps 10x, and guarantees businesses continuity by preventing downtime. Now, formerly a vice president of security products OCI at Oracle, Leon's professional experience spans tech in companies such as IBM, Tuition, and hosted PCI. He has 20 years of experience in product management, software design, and development, all through product deployment. Leon, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Ty, great to be with you.
All right, man. So let me start from the beginning. I think we all know, but just to bring everybody up to speed, when we talk about cloud, when we talk about cloud computing, give us a backdrop of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so it means different things to different people, right? And I like to break these out into kind of different groups of what we call cloud platforms. So at the very lowest level, you have something called infrastructure as a service. What does that mean? It just means instead of buying computers and shoving them into a data center and having to deal with all the complexity, and if you started a business 20 years ago or 15 years ago, that's what you would have to do, right? Because you would need a reliable internet connection, you would need cooling and racks and servers and all of that stuff. So infrastructure as a service, and there's like 3 big providers and many others, gets you out of that business of having to rack and stack servers. So who are those companies? Well, everyone knows Amazon AWS, Amazon Web Services. Google has a offering called Google Cloud or GCP, Google Cloud Public it's called, and then Microsoft has its cloud offering called Azure. And then there are a number of others from IBM and Oracle, and there are smaller players like DigitalOcean as well. So that's infrastructure as a service, and that's when you need the raw compute. So these are virtual machines or physical machines that you want. And then if you go up the stack, there's something called platform as a service. So what's platform as a service? This allows you to write your application at a kind of a higher level, so you don't have to worry about servers at all. It's considered a serverless environment because the cloud company takes care of those servers for you. So what's a good example of a PaaS platform? Well, like an extreme example is Salesforce. You could write lots of different applications on Salesforce using their built-in database and their programming language. And then there are many, many other examples.
So that being said, what do you think of the advantages? I mean, if we look at whether we look at platform infrastructure as a service, what do you think the advantages are of being able to do business on the cloud versus off?
Well, it really started as a mechanism to allow small companies and large companies to move quickly. Innovation requires rapid change. It requires rapid iterations, right? Like the first version of a product that you're going to put out there is going to suck. And you're going to need to iterate really quickly to make it less suck, right? Or suck less. So, make it a good product. So what cloud really solved was if an engineering team wanted to put up something for public consumption, they would have to go and find a bunch of money and data center space and then carve out budgets. And it was a whole process with the finance team. And as a startup, you would have to raise a bunch of money to afford the same thing. What cloud lets you do is for just a couple bucks, it lets you get started and you're paying as you go. So if you have a very low usage application, you're paying next to nothing to try your thing out. And then as it grows and as it scales, you pay more, but you're okay paying more because you have business to support that model.
Makes perfect sense to me. So you mentioned a bunch of companies and services that are out there. How do you determine which is the best source to go with?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And obviously, so the big 3, let's talk about the big 3, Azure, Google, and AWS. They are at or close to feature parity. In other words, they all have similar services to the kinds of things you would need to do to consume infrastructure as a service. But they all have kind of different ecosystems. So for example, Google comes from a very open source kind of ecosystem, but they have some proprietary pieces. Microsoft and Azure obviously come from folks that are well trained and well versed in Microsoft technologies such as .NET and Microsoft SQL Server. And AWS is its own set of ecosystems. So you got to be pretty careful about which service provider you choose up front because of vendor lock-in, right? Like the last thing you want to do is start using a bunch of proprietary things in a cloud and only to figure out that you ain't going anywhere because your application is way too dependent on those services and there's no open source or other alternative for those services.
So that makes sense. When we go through and try to filter, let's say we look at the big three, is there anything specific, since their features are very close to the same, that would push us to one versus the other?
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on what you're trying to build, and every cloud has different strengths. So if you're a Microsoft shop, why would you go anywhere else, right? Like it's going to be so easy for you to deploy Microsoft applications in Azure, and that kind of makes sense, especially if you're using Windows machines in the cloud. If you are doing things like big machine learning application, for example, right? You want to go to the cloud that has the best machine learning facilities, and Google has a really good offering, but so does AWS. So you really want to look at what you're most comfortable with, right? So I would say you start from the perspective of what technologies do I know best as a group of engineers, and then gravitate to the cloud that gives you the access to those technologies in the easiest possible way. I'll give you an example. Google has a data warehouse called BigQuery, and it's been used for marketing automation in e-commerce companies for a long time. You can get your Google Analytics data and drop it in there. If you're already familiar with BigQuery and Google Data Studio, it makes a lot of sense to have your applications closer to that data source, right? Amazon has some different tools, obviously, but they have something called DynamoDB. It's a different type of database, and it's kind of and if you're already familiar with that type of database, then it makes sense to use AWS because that's probably the only place where you're going to get DynamoDB at scale.
Makes perfect sense. Now, what do you guys do at Castai? I mean, what do you do to help businesses basically get set up and actually grow like on the cloud?
Yeah, so look, to explain that question, I have to kind of take you a little bit through a chronology of kind of the way applications have evolved in the cloud. So if you go back 20 years and you wrote a piece of software, right, you would deploy that piece of software on a physical computer, like literally on a server that was running an operating system, and your app would be very tightly bound to that physical server. And then with the advent of virtual machines, and VMware is kind of that legacy company that brought a big enterprise virtual machine tech stack to market, and there's others. And AWS, by the way, started this back in 2006, where you could rent what are called EC2 instances or virtual computers in the cloud through an API call. People started deploying their applications not on physical machines, but on virtual machines. So that was a smaller slice of the pie. If a server has 72 CPUs, maybe you're only using 2 CPUs or 4 CPUs for a virtual machine. And you get that at a much more cost-effective rate, and it allows customers to share physical infrastructure. So that was a great advent, right? So we went from physical to virtual. And then in the last several years, there's been this motion to say, well, virtual machines are great, but they're still too bulky. There's still too much overhead. I'm still paying too much for all of those extra trimmings. So is there a lighter unit of deployment? Can I deploy my application in the smallest possible footprint? And the answer is something called containers. So what's a container in the simplest form? It's the smallest unit of a kind of a compute instance with all of its dependencies bundled into a one image where you don't have to install any other software. It's all there in this very small footprint. And just to give you kind of an idea, you can run 110 of these containers on a typical computer, or 150 on a typical computer. So it's a much, much smaller, lighter weight footprint. And so the world has been kind of in software engineering world, we've kind of migrated to this DevOps mentality where software engineers take their software, they bundle them into images that are run as containers. And now these containers are the deployment unit. These are the things that get pushed to the cloud for ultimately running your application. So that's kind of the life cycle. And that's a long-winded way of getting to where we are. And so if you believe, and I believe the world is moving to 100% container deployments, all companies, even small startups, if they're writing their own software, they will use these units as the kind of smallest measure. And if you believe that to be true, then you need something to manage all of these containers. Like there are thousands of them running in an environment potentially. How are you managing their life cycle? Making sure all these things are healthy? It is it's a hard problem to solve. And so Google, in their wisdom, tongue in cheek a little bit, open source their internal project. It used to be called Borg internally at Google, but they renamed it to a more customer facing name. And the open source project is called Kubernetes. Kubernetes is a word it's a Greek word for navigator. And all of these tools around Kubernetes are all nautical themed. So Docker is a tool around Kubernetes, and you'll see a whole bunch of things, and they're all nautical themed. And the idea is Kubernetes is a management system for these containers. And if a few years ago there was a debate as to who was the winner in that space, there's no debate anymore. All of the clouds have a native Kubernetes offering that lets you manage and deploy your container software through their offering that is 100% open source compatible. So that's the long-winded way that we got to kind of our business thesis, which is if you believe it in containers and you believe that Kubernetes is going to be the clear container management winner. There's also two other things are true. Kubernetes is extremely complicated. And so you need a high level of skill to run it properly. And we don't have enough software engineers in the world. We're sure, like if you look for engineering talent recently in the market, you'll see that prices are going up and availability is scarce for good developers. So that's where we built our business on the fundamentals of all of these trends are going to occur, and we are going to meet customers there. And our goal and our mission is to make Kubernetes a completely automatic process, so that you don't have to have engineering talent worrying about turning the knobs and dealing with low-level problems. It should be an autonomous operation. Let the computers deal with the complexity, and you elevate your engineers to worry about the highest order things, the creative work that they're doing, which is actually developing the software that makes a difference to the business. So that's it in a nutshell.
So what are you seeing? I mean, I love your hypothesis of where things are going to go. And are you seeing that? Are you seeing trends now that it's moving towards everybody kind of getting into this container type of mentality, that is where the shift is actually occurring?
Yeah, if you look at the statistics, the growth of Kubernetes and container deployments is staggering, right? Like, and I know that a trend is solidified when the banking industry, like when you have like large stalwart banks that are moving in that same direction or already have massive budgets allocated, that it's a sticking trend. So yeah, we're seeing that absolute adoption is true. But Ty, a couple of other things are true about Kubernetes, which makes it an industry problem. One of them is it's super easy to over provision the infrastructure you need to run your applications. So we had this epiphany, and it started with like a startup. It started with a startup that I was building called ZenEdge several years ago. And it was a cybersecurity product. And we were building it, and we built it all in the cloud. So when we started the business, we didn't have the money for our own data centers, right? Kind of coming back to the topic that we started with. And so we said, all right, this is great. We're going to deploy our application. We're going to be lean. We're going to be smart. We're going to deploy 100% of it to the cloud. Fantastic move until it wasn't. And here's the problem. Every time I onboarded new customers, they got bigger and bigger. Customers loved the solution, but then I would get the bill at the end of the month. And then my CEO would come into my office and say, what's going on here, Leon? Like, you don't have costs under control. Things are growing exponentially. And then we would have this massive battle every month. And I failed because I didn't know why my bill was growing. I didn't have the insights. I didn't have the tools to automatically fix the things that I was using in the cloud. So when we sold the business to Oracle, it was like it was 2 orders of magnitude more than when we first started the company. So if we were paying a few $1,000s a month in cloud services at the beginning, we were paying hundreds of thousands of dollars at the end of the journey. And although the product was well received by analysts and customers, and there was a great outcome for all folks involved, but we failed on the cost side. And then I realized I'm not the only person who's failing here. Lots of companies are failing. In fact, the vast majority of companies don't have a handle on their cloud spend. And so that's the first problem we decided to solve at CAST. There's many problems to solve in an autonomous system, but the first problem, especially as you're turning economic downturn and everyone's tightening their belt, is how do you slash your cloud bill for resources that you don't use or you've over provisioned? And that's what the problem we started solving.
Yeah, so Cass, you're basically taking these big expensive bills like where you were. Well, give me an idea. You said that when you sold to Oracle, for example, you guys, your cloud computing was hundreds of thousands a month. Let's say hundreds means 300,000 a month. With what you guys do now, like what kind of dent does it make in a company like that with that kind of spend? Can you estimate that? I don't even know if that's a fair question.
It is, because I see what we're doing for customers now, and I know what my workload looked like back then. I would say we were wasting 60% of our resources.
Wow. So 60% of the resources, money was being spent on stuff you didn't really need. And now with what you guys are doing, you're only really spending money on what you actually need. And as a result, dramatically can cut the cost because you're just buying what you're actually using.
Yeah, and part of the problem is it's a cloud economics question. The cloud has a catalog of inventory, right? And you as a human have to sort through like in the case of AWS, there's literally 500, 600 types of computers that you can rent. Well, which one do you get? And what life cycle do you purchase them? Because there's different discount schemes that they've created over time. So do I go for the long-term commitment? Do I go for just pay as you go? Which computer do I use? Like, how are human beings supposed to solve that problem when the inventory is constantly changing and availability of that inventory is constantly changing? So part of what we do is we catalog all of that stuff, and then we make a decision every 15 seconds on a customer behalf of what to bring in or what to remove because it's too expensive or because there's better alternatives.
And it makes a lot of sense because I experimented with this for the first time the other day with AWS. They give me a bunch of options. I don't know. I don't know. Like, I'm not a software developer guy. Like, I'm not an engineer. Like, I don't know those things. So I just randomly choose because there's too many options to even be able to research each one to know I'm making the right decision. And then I move forward. No big deal when my cost is minimal. But then as I grow and really put a lot of stuff on the server, I can clearly see how the costs get way out of hand. And I have no idea how to bring them down. I don't even realize that I'm paying for services I'm not using. I don't even realize that decision I made in the very beginning is adversely affecting me because I don't know. I didn't know what I was basing the decision on. So, I mean, really smart what you guys are doing.
And the problem kind of gets a little bit worse. And I went through this exact same kind of like denial, anger, coming to I went through that whole cycle of grief when I was trying to reconcile this for myself. And the problem gets worse because if you go to the cloud, if you went to AWS after you started growing, right, and you got to keep the wheels on the truck, you're not going to pull the plug because you have customers that depend on you. So when you go back to AWS and they say, how can I lower my bill? This is killing me. They say, no problem. Ty, we've got you. We want you to commit for 1 to 3 years, and you have an option of putting some money down, and we'll give you a discount. We'll give you a 40% discount or a 30% discount. But then what have you done? You've just this is like the fox guarding the hen house, in my opinion, because all you've done is you've committed for a 3-year term. That's no better than when you were negotiating for data center space and you have to sign 3-year deals back in 2000. It's the same exact paradigm. I think that those types of savings plans and reservations while required in some cases, they are a necessary evil. And we try to push customers. We try to slowly migrate customers out of those long-term commitments so that they're using the cheapest possible resources at the moment. Part of the problem is computers continuously get cheaper over time. Maybe not right now in this current supply chain crunch, but in the long term, you've heard of Moore's law, means that every 18 months, computing power doubles, which means costs should halve, right? Well, you already committed to pricing from a plan that could have been 3 years old, right?
Right.
So it doesn't make any sense. So I think it gets even worse as you try to look for solutions that are just masking the problem, just putting some lipstick on it, as opposed to solving the root cause, which is you're using too much and the wrong things.
Huh. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Now, what you're talking about, does it work for brand new businesses? Like if I'm just getting started, is there even a world anymore where people need this kind of bandwidth and they're actually creating their own data centers?
No, people don't. I mean, that is a ridiculous money spend. Like the whole point of the cloud, in my opinion, is to get people started quickly, right? Like you should absolutely be using the cloud. It's just a smarter way of using it, right? Like you got to think about how your costs are going to scale. So in kind of like, I'll use software as a service because this is the thing I'm most familiar with, Ty. But in the software, there's a couple of key metrics that investors and business folks look for. One of them is gross margin. You have to be constructing your business model in such a way that you're close to 70 to 80% gross margin, which means your cost of goods sold is no more, your cloud costs are no more than 20% of the revenue that you're bringing in. I'll give you an interesting fact. If you look at Snapchat public documentation, take a guess at how much money, what's their percentage of cloud spend?
You mean of what they spend in total?
Yeah, relative to their revenue.
Oh man. I don't know, 37%.
Yeah, it's close to half the money they take in, they pay to AWS.
Wow.
Right?
That's crazy.
Now imagine that at the scale of billions of dollars, right? So if you don't set that up correctly, pretty early on in your journey, I'd say within the first year of your kind of, like initially you're looking for product market fit, which means you're looking to see, is there a market for my service and customers willing to pay for it? During that journey, as you see yourself getting to product market fit, as an entrepreneur, you should be thinking about, okay, I've got a product, I've got customers willing to pay for it, and am I going to be able to deliver that service at a reasonable gross margin of 80% around? And if the answer to that is yes, then you're off to the races, and the cloud is the right choice for you.
Okay, what about security? Because literally this is what happens. Because I'm not a developer, right? I own a software company. I'm really good on the marketing sales side. The development side is not mine. But when I think about my data in a data center, like with all these servers, I think about the movies of people fighting in there with axes and destroying the servers. And then I'm like, seriously, like I think about that. Like, how safe is my data in a place like Amazon? Like, what does Amazon do to keep that safe? What happens if there's an electrical surge that takes out those servers? Somebody physically destroys the servers. Like, is that data gone? Like, what kind of security is when I'm using a place like AWS that my data is even going to be secure to begin with?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ty. And so I could spend hours talking about this because it's really, cybersecurity is like, that's all I did for many, many years. But the truth is that AWS, Google, Azure, IBM, Oracle, they do cybersecurity disaster recovery far better than the average tech entrepreneur could ever do, right? So let me give you a couple of examples just to illustrate the point. AWS and all clouds have these things called availability zones. So in a region, let's say the region is US East, that means you're somewhere in Ashburn, in that area, you will have physical data centers that they've separated by some number of miles, like we'll call it 20, I don't remember what the technical term is, but I think it's 25 miles. And so they give you mechanisms to make sure that your application and data can stay replicated and redundant across those data centers for relatively little money. At scale, it gets worse, but for relatively little money, you can achieve disaster recovery that you would have never been able to do on your own in a single data center. Okay? And I'll give you one cybersecurity example. So one of the key things that you look at when you're worrying about protecting your data at rest, so the data that's sitting on hard drive somewhere, is how is that data encrypted, right? What's the encryption envelope to make sure that if someone physically takes that hard drive and walks out it, can they get at your data? And so the clouds have gone to great pains to make sure that encryption technology is extremely well set up. And I'll give you one example. AWS and all of the clouds have a service called Key Management Service. And what happens is when you create the raw encryption key material, they store it in a special device that's FIPS compliant, which means it's a government lab certified for the highest level top secret agencies in our country. That box is certified to be tamper proof and will self-destruct if anyone tries to tamper with your encryption keys. And so they offer that as a service. If you had to go buy that hardware, it would be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars for a typical device. But here you're able to rent a sliver for a couple bucks a month, right? Just for the 2 encryption keys you need or the 3 encryption keys you need. And there are so many cybersecurity services that these clouds offer. The problem doesn't become, can I get the security I need? The problem becomes the point that you alluded to at the very beginning when we started talking about cloud. There are so many options here. What do I choose? Like, how do I sort through all of these cybersecurity features and tools, and which one is going to actually make me more secure? Which one is going to make things too complicated for me? Does that kind of make sense, Ty?
It makes perfect sense. Does Cast help with that? Does Cast help me figure that out?
Yeah. So, and by the way, I just want to give you one example, like on the complexity side. So a couple of years ago, there was an interesting breach in AWS. It was Capital One leaked 100 million social security numbers. I mean, you might have remembered this, 100 million social security numbers to the internet. I wouldn't want to be the CISO on that day, the chief security officer for Capital One. But they were a poster child for cloud security. Like, they followed all the AWS best practices. They were giving lectures and talks on how to use cloud securely. And it turned out to be a misconfiguration between their application and the way they thought services worked and what the actual cloud provided. And this all comes down to a single problem that the clouds use, and it's called a shared responsibility model. What does that mean? It means we're going to take care of our stuff, you take care of your stuff, and together you will have a secure environment. The problem is that there's a gray area in the middle. There's a gray area where we're not sure if it's your responsibility and we're not sure if it's the customer's responsibility. And that's where the shared responsibility model completely breaks down. And this is where we want to enter the picture. So remember at the beginning, I said, I want to handle autonomous Kubernetes. That's the future of application, software application. I want to handle all autonomous features, not just the cost piece, just happens to be the first leg of the platform that we built. The second leg of the platform that we're building is the cybersecurity piece. And I want to make that autonomous as well. In other words, there are so many hundreds of best practices for the cloud and for Kubernetes. Specifically, customers can't keep it straight. They have no idea how well they're doing. So they have these massive security teams. In the case of larger companies, they have these massive security teams. I want to reduce that complexity. And we don't have an offering there, but by the end of this year, we'll have the beginning of our cybersecurity offering for Kubernetes, which will make the platform even further automated so that customers can stay hands off.
When do I get started with Castai.ai? Do I start in the beginning of my business before costs get out of hand? Is it a certain amount of growth before I'd even consider a service like yours? Like, when at what stage do I need to consider what you guys have?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of startups that use our service, but they are further along. I would say they are closer to product market fit, and they've already have an engineering team. Like, when you're building a prototype, Ty, and you might be doing it in Figma or some other mock-up tool, and you're just showing it to customers, obviously way too early. When you start deploying your first piece of code that you know you're going to throw away in 6 months, we're still too early for you. But once you've decided that, oh, I'm going to use containerization, I'm going to have this kind of continuous DevOps process, which is kind of the modern way of deploying applications, and then you choose Kubernetes as your destination platform, that's when we get involved. So, like, we chose a very extreme area of focus, which is this Kubernetes environment, believing that most customers will get there. If you ain't on Kubernetes, we're obviously not a good fit for you.
Makes sense. Where can everybody go, Leon, that's interested in getting started with you guys and getting started with, on the cloud, wants to do it the right way, wants to be able to save money, wants to be with a company that has the foresight to see what's happening in the future, eventually jump into areas like security, et cetera. But what steps should they take to be able to learn more?
Absolutely. So if you go to cast.ai, we have a couple of interesting tools. First of all, we have a free entry tool. Any customer that's already running a cloud Kubernetes instance, like in any of the 3 clouds, they can install this little agent it's free to download, free to install, takes about 3 minutes. and we generate a savings report for you in a couple of minutes after the installation. We just need to see a few time series data points to understand where you're wasting most of your money, right? And then people say, like, even on $1,000, if you can save 700 of that, why wouldn't you, right? Like that is money that you can use for a bunch of other things to grow your business. And we offer the recommendations that you can take by yourself. You don't need to pay us anything for the service. You can just keep that agent installed and keep getting reports. And then when you're ready, when you're growing and you're ready to kind of sign up for a more substantial commercial automation, like a commercial contract with us, then it's just an easy process. Someone will get in touch with you and take you to the next step. We also have a great Slack community group, so you can sign up for that and talk to other startups and tech folks that are in your space that might have great advice for you. So I would encourage everyone to kind of join that Slack channel.
Sounds awesome. Leon, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for the great questions, Ty. I really appreciate it.
So listen, if you're watching this, this is the future. Cloud computing is no brainer. I mean, like Leon said, there's no longer a world where you go get data centers and pay for all that. And even if you could, just the protection, the security, everything like that is so far above and beyond what normal companies do. So cloud computing is a given. I mean, that's where we're going. We're all building these stuff on the cloud. But the problem is that it's so cheap to get started that we don't understand that quickly we're overpaying. And as the costs grow, as the business grows, it just eats your margin. It just erodes your margin until a large portion of what you pay. And Leon's even given examples here. Very big companies where 50% nearly of their cost is in the cloud computing side. And the scary thing is the larger percentage of that is completely wasted. It's completely not needed. And there's nobody that you're paying in these services that's going to protect you, because that says against their best interest. You're paying them the money for stuff you don't need. So if you want to solve this problem, and you should, if you're already using cloud, if you're not, and you're going to start a business, you're going to be using cloud anyways. Either way, go to Castai.ai. A lot of stuff at Cast.ai I found. Well, they have a whole resources section, including a blog of all kinds of details on anything related to these kind of topics that we dove into today. I like the fact that there's a quick tool. You install something, and then you can find out realistically what your savings are within minutes, amongst many other tools and resources that are there. So make sure you visit Cast.ai, Cast.ai. Look, I think Leon and I both think that more of your money as a business owner should stay in your pocket, but that's not going to happen if you're wastefully spending money. And if you don't have the kind of knowledge and experience that he has, which, let's be honest, none of us really do, then we're wasting money, don't even know about it. And that doesn't have to happen that way. So go to Cast.ai, put this simple tool to figure out what you're wasting now, look at the other resources available, and get started so you can stop the waste, put more money in your pocket, and make it easier to be able to have better margins that help you make more money and make your enterprise value of your company worth more as well. So thanks for tuning in. Make sure you visit Cast.ai.